MGTOW isn't something new. Many people think that MGTOW, which stands for men going their way, is a new concept, but its roots go back to ancient times. I knew about it, not the term, but the idea, from a young age. I have always been a big reader, and British authors have always been one of my favorite types of books. Mistreatment of women in British writing. Of course, not all British authors are bad for women. But a lot of people are, in subtle or not so subtle ways. Of course, this is true of a lot of authors, but I didn't find the same level of sexism in Anna Karenina by Tolstoy or in French authors, for example. They showed the sexism in their culture accurately, without adding their kind of misogyny to it. When you look back, you can see that James Bond, Of Human Bondage, the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and even the very funny Jeeves books all had some kind of misogynistic message. At least Wodehouse made fun of everyone and showed how silly different parts of British society were. Misogyny, on the other hand, was romanticized in the James Bond books, which made it seem not only socially acceptable but also desirable and sophisticated. In real life, there are a lot of stories about British explorers and leaders who didn't care about women or were even mean to them. In the movie My Fair Lady, the character of Professor Henry Higgins was based on real British upper-class people. The British were also not new to being bad to women. Read the works of Greek and Roman philosophers, early Christians, early Jews, and early Muslims, among others. There was a lot of misogyny in the ancient world. But I think there was one thing that set the British apart from other societies during the colonial and post-colonial periods. It was a boarding school for British kids. Where boarding schools in Britain came from. In the Middle Ages, literate clerics taught boys at boarding schools. By the 18th century, boarding schools were a way for people from the upper and upper middle classes to teach their sons so that they could take their rightful place in the expanding empire. The elite still paid for private tutors or governesses for their girls. Girls were sometimes sent to finishing schools, which could be in Switzerland or France. But boys were often sent to boarding schools as young as 7 years old, while girls were not sent away from home until they were teenagers. The sad things that happen in the book The Lord of the Flies are partly caused by the fact that young boys are taken from a culture of daily love as part of a family and put on their own before they were ready. In a way, the book is a good example of how British boarding schools work. Boarding schools and the spread of colonies. The boarding schools made sure that British values were taught to both children born in the colonies and those who grew up in Great Britain. The goal was to spread good ideas that would help the British reach their imperial goals in the long run. George Monbiot writes emotionally about how these boarding schools are more than just places to learn. They are places where people are afraid, cruel, and hurt. He says that they make bullies scared. He says that the British government is run by a small, unrepresentative elite, people who went to private boarding schools and then to Oxford or Cambridge for college. Monbiot thinks that this leads to a ruling class that is dishonest, loyal to its group, and has no morals. For those who don't understand how British colonialism could have been so bad when most British people weren't, this might help. Monbiot says that while the boys were being abused, the staff didn't care about their pain. Boys have to learn how to sink or swim, and they have to keep a straight face. Virginia Woolf said that the rough treatment of young boys could lead to the rough treatment of people in colonies. It also made people in Britain less nice to women. Many of the people in charge of the British Empire thought that the mental damage and trauma they had gone through gave them strength and helped them get and keep control of the empire. Because of this, they tried to keep it going. Misogyny and boarding schools for girls. Imagine being a young boy who was taken away from his mother when he was only 7 or 8 years old. You were moved to a place where there was no love. When you cried for your mother, older boys would often beat and hurt you, and no one would help you. It's not surprising that so many well-educated British men later looked down on women or even hated them. Women were seen as either helpless, because they didn't stop their children from being taken, or bad, because they didn't stop it, since many encouraged it. There may have also been the jealousy of sisters who got to stay at home for most of their childhoods. This article shows that there is a link between the abuse of girls in boarding schools and the abuse of women in places like Hollywood. How does this relate to MGTOW? Well, there are also very good boarding schools in the United States. I think the same thing happened in other places that used to be part of the British Empire. Even though only a small number of people ever go to these schools, those who do are part of the ruling class. Their dislike of women and sense of superiority spreads to the rest of society. Is there a link between the casual sexism of people like Donald Trump or John F. Kennedy and the sexism of MGTOW? How do you feel?